Great. Amazing. So before we begin, I'm going to introduce all of you to Marcos, who is going to be the convener of these biodiversity and livelihood sessions. Marcos is a member of the Global Environment Network. He participated in the Global Environment Summer Academy last year, where Nessie, Gary, Inanch, and myself had the chance to get to know him. And Marcos has now taken on a role of working with other GEN members like himself to bring them together for sessions like these, where we share knowledge and skills about particular subjects. So I'll just introduce Marcos's background a little bit. He is a Swiss-Paraguayan anthropologist and agroecologist, and he works on Indigenous rights, livelihoods, environmental change, and adaptation via participatory research. So he has done field work in Latin America, and he explores the intersections and frontiers of human rights and environmental sustainability. And he has more than 10 years of action and research engagement with academia, development cooperation, and grassroots organizations. At the moment, he is living in Germany. Marcos, if you want to say a few words, you may go ahead, and then Marcos is going to introduce our speaker for today, Simone.
Thank you, Simran. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see you again. It's a great pleasure for me to being here facilitating this session. As you know, this is the first session of a new series of the Biodiversity and Livelihoods Collective of the Global Environment Networks. And just before we continue, I thought maybe we could briefly introduce ourselves by writing our names and where are we connecting from in the chat, so we can have some idea and give Simone some idea of who is connecting and where are we connecting from. Okay, today we're going to start off by looking at the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. As you may know, the 15th Conference of the Parties of the UN Convention of Biodiversity took place in Montreal in December last year. You may have seen that immediately after the conference, some civil society organizations celebrated the outcomes and the recognitions of Indigenous people's rights, but meanwhile others denounced the corporate capture and greenwashing. So that's why we invited today Simone Lovera, the environmental activist affiliated to Greenpeace International, who will share their views and impressions about this framework and the COP15 negotiations itself. After her presentation, we will have a question and answers round. So let me introduce you Simone Lovera. Simone, as said, is affiliated to Greenpeace International. She is a co-founder and former managing coordinator of the Global Forest Coalition. And her areas of expertise are the carbon offsets, international forest policies, biodiversity conservation, Indigenous rights, international environmental law, women and biodiversity, payments for environmental services, market-based conservation mechanism, and agrofuels. I personally know Simone because she also lived in Paraguay for many, many years. So that's why I feel really honored to have the opportunity to introduce her today. And I hope that Simone's presentation will encourage and motivate you to share your own views, your own stories, and problems around this topic. So I will now hand it over to Simone, who I'm sure she has a lot to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and it's really nice to be here. Really nice to see several familiar faces as well. I've always had a lot of appreciation for GDF and also for the Global Environment Network. So yeah, I'll try to share my screen. Is this? I hope you can all see this correctly. So yeah, as Marcus said, this is quite a long talked about result. The Global Biodiversity Framework, partly celebrated, partly also criticized. A lot of concerns have been expressed. I'll try to show a little bit both perspectives. First, the basics. So, as you may know, the Global Biodiversity Convention, the Convention on Biodiversity, is one of the conventions that was signed originally at the Rio 1992 Earth Summit. It has, for many years been developed. Several protocols were added, a protocol on biosafety, a protocol on access and benefit sharing of genetic resources, and subsequently on liability issues related to that. And at a certain moment, it was realized that what's really lacking is effective implementation of this convention. So they started developing strategic plan. The first strategic plan was called Aichi targets. It ran from 2010 to 2020. Those were 20 targets. And yeah, the evaluations actually were that they haven't been very well implemented. So then the need was felt to develop a second strategic plan that was a little bit more ambitious and also more strategic in terms of really addressing the main drivers of biodiversity loss, and really developing also more of a theory of change with clear global goals and some principles, and then the targets. I'll mainly talk about the targets. If people want to know more about the global goals, I think they're rather generic. The overall mission is to live in harmony with nature by 2050. That was already the overall mission of the first strategic plan, and that has basically been maintained. Now, this plan, of course, was supposed to start in 2020, but due to COVID, the negotiations were postponed. The big summit that was planned for 2020 could not take place. It was supposed to be taking place in China, in Kunming. It was postponed several times, and all the way in the end, China actually withdrew its offer to host the organization, the meeting, because it became too complex for them, because they still had a very strict COVID policy. At the moment, the summit was supposed to be happening. It was actually one month or so before they lifted all a couple of weeks before they lifted all the restrictions. But anyhow, at that moment, they really feared a very big summit would be very dangerous for the health situation in the country. So then Canada, which also hosts the Secretariat to the Convention on Biodiversity, decided to offer to also host this meeting. What was another big complication, actually, is that originally it was supposed to be a big summit. And China decided to go ahead actually with a summit in hybrid format in 2021, in October 2021, where most of the Chinese politicians that were one way or another involved in biodiversity policy actually showed up, and the president, and it was a very big summit, very much nationally focused. But most participation from outside China at that moment was virtual. And this second meeting was then not held as a summit, insofar that Xi Jinping himself, the president of China, the People's Republic of China, decided not to come to the meeting, and thereby also not to invite other heads of state to the meeting. So instead of the big heads of state summit that was originally foreseen, this was a ministerial level conference. I must say that might have facilitated actually the final deal, because it became a little bit less politicized because of that. But there has been a concern that this actually drew away a lot of opportunity for making this a very big media summit as well. And the media attention was there, but it was definitely a lot less than we would have hoped for. in the end, they did succeed to, actually a lot of people surprised, to reach an agreement. And I must say, I did admire, there was sort of a joint presidency by Canada and China, but especially the Chinese presidency, I had the idea, did a lot of quite strategic bridging of opinions between the different groups in the negotiations. In the end, there was quite a mistake in trying to adopt it, which was probably due to translations partly, and also misadvised by the Secretariat insofar that the Chinese government had presented this Global Biodiversity Framework as part of a package of 6 decisions, which also included a decision on finance, resource mobilization. And the Democratic Republic of Congo said at the last plenary suddenly that they could not accept this decision on finance because it didn't include a special fund for biodiversity that they had wanted to see. And that objection was sort of overruled. And I must say, this is the face actually at the moment that he was listening, obviously, to the translations and misinterpreted some things. But well, typically, first there was a lot of protest that the president first still accepted the package. But then the next day, they seem to have been able to convince the Democratic Republic of Congo that they should accept the package. So they came into the room all jointly together, very happy. And DRC openly stated that they were willing to accept the decision after all. Then we all thought everything was fine. And then suddenly whole row ended up about basically a very technical detail of participation of the Central and Eastern European group in the next bureau, and Russia protested that it had been discriminated against, that they had a very good candidate, and that pure for political reasons that candidate hadn't been accepted. A lot of West European countries then said that they couldn't accept any Russian candidate, and in the end, there was no resolution to that whole issue. So due to these tensions, the conference was actually formally suspended. There's formally is supposed to be still one more COP15 session just to resolve this whole issue about the bureau. But I think they're going to just postpone this until the war hopefully is over soon. Anyhow, as said, it was quite a comprehensive package of decisions. So it's not just a global biodiversity framework. At the same moment, they also adopted a whole monitoring framework. That was actually a bit controversial because a lot of people had said, let's first just make sure that we know what we want, what the targets are, and only then we can start talking about indicators. But they went ahead and they already developed these indicators. And I fear that partly as a result, the indicators are actually a lot more conventional and conservationist than the Global Biodiversity Framework, which, as I will explain, includes quite a paradigm shift as far as conservation policies is concerned towards more rights-based conservation. And that is not properly reflected yet in monitoring framework, which is quite of concern. It was very much developed by biological scientists with little inclusion of social science indicators. Well, the framework would actually ask for those social science indicators. Also, mechanisms for planning, monitoring, reporting, and review were adopted. That includes obligations to adapt existing national biodiversity strategies and action plans to these new targets, to ensure these targets are incorporated at the national level, and also to report regularly on their implementation. There was a decision on capacity building and developing a technical and scientific cooperation. A very controversial one, as I said, on resource mobilization. The key elements are there also in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but on top of that, there was a whole discussion about a possible new biodiversity global biodiversity fund. This was a strong demand of very large group of developing countries. In the end, no consensus could be reached, and they decided to establish a new biodiversity trust fund under the existing financial mechanism, which is the Global Environment Facility. The big trick there is the Global Environment Facility is partly hosted by the World Bank and, for example, the United States of America, which has not ratified the Biodiversity Convention, is part of the governing structure of the Global Environment Facility, which has always been considered a little bit of an anomaly. So that is why, they wanted really a separate global biodiversity fund. But so in the end, the compromise was reached despite some opposition by not just African, but also other countries of this new biodiversity trust fund. It does have what you call a sunset clause, which means that there's basically an agreement that this trust fund will be phased out by 2030. And in the meantime, there will be negotiations and discussions about a possible separate fund. There's a decision on digital sequence information on genetic resources. This is a very complicated technical issue. If people have questions about it, just ask me, but I think for the interest of time, I don't want to go too deep in this, but this basically, you know, was a very big loophole in the access on benefit sharing of genetic resources, because nowadays with digital sequence information, you can very easily access genetic resources without actually physically being there. And this new decision starts up a process of trying to close this loophole, and there's a basic agreement that the benefits of digital sequence information should be actively shared, including through a fund. And on top of that, there's almost 40 other decisions, which I will not go in depth. I'll really focus on the Global Biodiversity Framework as of now, but please feel free to ask more questions about those. What's probably most interesting for a lot of people here is that that also includes a decision on a new work program on Indigenous knowledge, that so-called Article 8J, which is about the traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And there was also agreement on a new gender plan of action, which is quite strong and really calls for very strong integration of gender considerations throughout biodiversity policies. As I will explain later, this is also reflected in the Global Biodiversity Framework itself. And for example, a very nice decision on nature and culture. So what is the biggest outcome of this Global Biodiversity Framework? I think the biggest outcome by far is this paradigm shift towards far more rights-based, socially equitable and gender-just conservation policies. That is why it has been really celebrated as a victory by Indigenous peoples, by women's movements, and by basically a lot of social justice groups, even though a lot of people have also expressed, you know, some concerns about some of the less positive issues in the Global Biodiversity Framework. But I think it's important that people are aware of these positive sides, because it's really quite significant that after years of struggle about emphasizing of large social movements, scientific movements, a lot of scientific work has been done on this, on raising the importance of Indigenous peoples' approaches to conservation, of local community initiative in the field of conservation, you know, traditional customary use, the whole importance of traditional knowledge, the whole role of women in this, that this has now been recognized actually in this framework, and that especially the rights of Indigenous peoples are really emphasized at several key moments in this framework. And I think that this is very much due also to the Indigenous peoples themselves. They have done a fantastic job in terms of influencing this whole process, showcasing all this success stories, showcasing how strong this was. And I think they were overall supported, you know, by all the NGOs that were there, needless to say also by Greenpeace, which had some Indigenous representatives also in its delegation. So some of the key outcomes are that, for example, that all areas should be subject to participatory, biodiversity inclusive planning. They should be managed sustainably, and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities should be respected. This is reflected in several targets throughout the Global Biodiversity Framework. For example, the very first target is often overlooked. People start often talking about the 30 by 30 targets, which I'll talk about later, but this is actually much more ambitious, because it says that the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance should be close to 0 by 2030. So that's basically 100% conservation of areas of high biodiversity importance. And it's really important people realize this is 100%, and that, you know, it's not just 30%. But also what's really important, that it should be under participatory integrated biodiversity inclusive planning. So, you know, people should be really part of it, and while respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So in this whole biodiversity planning process, in this whole effort to ensure that, you know, high biodiversity areas are not being lost anymore by 2030, the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities should be respected. There's also a very strong target adopted, number 22, on full, actable, inclusive, effective, and gender responsive representation and participation in decision making. By indigenous peoples or local communities, also by women and girls, children and youth, persons with disabilities. And in that, there's a very important recognition that the full protection of environmental human rights defenders should be ensured. Now, this is actually something that's quite revolutionary. I mean, there has been a lot of talk, and probably people know that there's a very serious situation already since decades, actually, about environmental human rights defenders, especially people on the front line. A lot of indigenous activists, community activists, continue to be massacred in horrific cases of human rights violations. And it's really positive that at least the Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes this huge problem of people being assassinated just because they're trying to defend their environment, and really calls on government to ensure that these people are better protected. Because, of course, if they are not better protected, there also cannot be real, actable, and inclusive participation, because how can you participate if you risk your life? As I said, the gender aspect is also really important. This has been a very hard fought for by the women's movements. I must say this has really been an uphill battle. Not even a year ago, last March, there was still a little bit feeling that, we might not be able to have a self-standing gender target in this Global Biodiversity Framework. There was a lot of opposition against it, but I think with all the women's movements there, we've really succeeded to fight this uphill battle with all kinds of very innovative advocacy strategies. Actually, a lot of support, particularly from the Latin American countries, I should say. That was really amazing. And thanks to that, there's now a real target on gender equality in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the very last target, that also recognize, for example, the right to equal rights and access to land and natural resources of women and girls, and their full, actable, meaningful, informed participation and leadership in biodiversity decision-making and policy-making. So I think this is a very important recognition, and it's really hoped that this will also have a lot of impact on the ground. And now in all biodiversity policies, but also concrete conservation actions, there will be far more attention for the role of women, the rights of women, and the needs of women. And then there's, of course, this famous target about the 30%. However, I do want to emphasize that this is at least 30%. And that doesn't mean that, for example, for forests, you now only have to conserve 30%. Rather the opposite. It's talking about all terrestrial land. And as the majority, some 60% of all terrestrial land is, for example, being used already for meat and dairy production. I mean, it's really important that what is still remaining in terms of nature is that at least all of that is conserved. So basically, you can still talk about like 100% forest conservation under this target. Actually, if you look at the figures, and there was a very confusing debate about this just a couple of days before this target was adopted, and there's been a lot of campaigning around this by some organizations, and like, oh, we need 30% of the planet conserved. But the silly thing was that a couple of days before the target was adopted, there was actually an intense debate, because they finally discovered that if you really take into account not just protected areas, but also, as you see in the text, other effective area-based conservation measures, so-called OECMs, a dreadful abbreviation, but it's basically a very large concept. That means that, for example, community conserved areas and also indigenous peoples conserved areas, that are those areas that indigenous peoples have decided they want to be recognized as indigenous peoples and community conserved areas, an ICCA, that all those areas are included. And if you then add up what's already there, we are actually already above 30%. At this moment, 31% of the territory of the world's terrestrial land, not water, it's different for oceans, but terrestrial land is already covered by protected areas, official protected areas, and OECMs and ICCAs, indigenous peoples' territories and community conserved areas. So we already passed the 30%. However, the big issue is that a lot of this is not effectively conserved and managed, and it's not actively governed. And the fascinating thing is that a lot of the ICCAs are actually, because if you look at the definition what an indigenous people's territory community conserved area is, territories as life as they are called by the ICCA consortium themselves. If you look at the definition, per definition they have to be effectively managed, they have to have a positive conservation outcome, and per definition they have to be actively governed. That's also inherent to the definition of an ICCA. So actually that part is already there. The big challenge is on the protected area side, which is about 16% of the world's terrestrial land at the moment. Those protected areas are very often not actively governed and not effectively conserved. So the big challenge in this target is actually to enhance the quality of conservation, to make sure that what is at this moment formally protected as protected areas is actually governed and effectively conserved. Also effectively conserved, for example, against mining, logging, and even climate change and nitrogen depositions. What's also in here is that any sustainable use, where appropriate in such area, is fully consistent with conservation outcomes. That means that, for example, those loggers that still claim that they can do a lot of logging in protected areas, and you see that a lot in Europe, for example, they can no longer do that within this framework, because any sustainable use should really be consistent with conservation outcomes. If it impacts negatively on the conservation, it's basically not in line with this target. And then the most important recognition in this whole target is recognizing indigenous peoples and traditional territories, and recognizing and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their territories. It's actually twice there, which is quite unique. If you ask me why was that, well, it was late and people were tired and they said, okay, let's just go for this compromise. So that's why the little bit irrational point at the same point is made twice, but it's only positive because it really re-emphasizes how important this point was seen. And it's actually really positive that all parties have now formally committed to recognizing and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, including over their traditional territories. And mind you, this is including, of course, there's also the right to participate in biodiversity policy in general, of course. Meanwhile, there's also very important other targets that respect the rights of indigenous peoples. For example, the target on the management and use of wild species, which has to be sustainable. There was a clear clause added that should be protecting and encouraging customary sustainable use by indigenous peoples and local communities. So that's also a very important breakthrough that, that right to customary sustainable use is now recognized. And for example, target 19, which talks about financial resources, there's a lot of issues around that target, but it does also recognize that one of the resources that should be mobilized for conservation is collective action as a resource. And that means a non-financial approach and a non-market-based approach to biodiversity conservation, clearly recognizing that these collective actions by indigenous peoples and local communities, and these non-market-based approaches, which are actually also recognized in the Paris Agreement, that they are a very important resource to be mobilized, to ensure biodiversity conservation, that this is something that should be absolutely supported. And then, for example, if you talk about forests, it's important to recognize that in Target 10, it says that all areas under fishery, forestry should be managed sustainably, conserving and restoring biodiversity. Same for agriculture, same for agriculture. So basically, same for fishery. So basically, there's an agreement that all these productive sectors should be reformed to ensure complete sustainability, for maintaining nature's contributions to people, as they say. Then there's two other targets I really would like to emphasize, which I think should really also be used by people to make sure that this is implemented on the ground. Because once again, all these targets are just targets on paper unless people really try to use them in their work, in their activities on the ground, in their advocacy work with governments. One is about halting and redirecting financial flows that are supporting destruction. There's a very important target actually that calls for the full integration of biodiversity in all policies, regulations, planning and development policies, poverty eradication strategies, assessments, etc., national accounting, within and across all levels of government and across all sectors. So basically biodiversity should be everywhere as of now. At least that's something we should strive for. And what's really important here is also the commitment to progressively align all relevant public and private activities, fiscal and financial flows with the goals and targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this is a very important call to divest from destruction, because one of the big analyses that has been done prior to the adoption of this Global Biodiversity Framework is that actually the amount of money that is currently spent on destruction of biodiversity is a large multiple of the amount of money that is spent on biodiversity conservation. And that if we do not redirect all these financial flows that are currently going to destruction, there's no way we are going to conserve biodiversity. I mean, the first thing we need to do really is to stop financing destruction. And that means stop financing destruction by banks and by corporations. You know, we should challenge every investment that's going into a biodiversity destruction, whether it's logging, intensive livestock farming, whether it's bioenergy production on a large scale, or whether it's mining. But we should also very much challenge public financial flows to these things. And in this relate, another very important target is about subsidies and fiscal benefits, because it was also recognized that, you know, there's still billions of what they call perverse incentives. So subsidies, fiscal benefits, and other incentives stimulating biodiversity destruction. And these perverse subsidies got a lot of renewed attention also in this resource mobilization strategy that was separately adopted. So there is now a target to identify by 2025 and eliminate, phase out, or reform incentives harmful for biodiversity in a proportionate, just, fair, effective, and actable way. So there is a need clearly for a just transition. I mean, there are a lot of people's livelihoods sometimes connected to these subsidies, so it should be done in a just transitional way. But in the end, you know, there should be, there's a target to progressively reduce them by at least $500 billion per year by 2030. That could have been more ambitious, but still, I do think if we get this implemented, we're already a lot further in field of biodiversity conservation. And then there's, for example, a target on consumption, which is a lot weaker than we would have wanted to see it, but it does include an already earlier adopted target to halve global food waste and significantly reduce overconsumption and waste generation. I think it's really important, if you talk about food waste, that we should also start looking more and more about protein waste in this respect. I mean, the fact that 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is being used to produce feed for animals instead of food for people is just something that we should really be challenging in times of rising food prices and a lot of people facing malnutrition and starvation. So what is missing in the GBF? Of course, it's always when something is adopted, you know, people start looking at what's there and they don't see what was supposed to be there. One of the biggest things that's missing is that there are no ambitious legally binding targets to halt corporate destruction. And this very much had to do with the fact that corporations were very strongly represented. The financial sector was very strongly represented at this biodiversity meeting and at prior negotiations. And there was also a very close collaboration between the Secretariat and a lot of big corporations, and actually also a lot of governments, especially northern governments with corporations. So target 15 was supposed to be about corporate accountability, but it basically only asked governments to ensure corporations provide information on their destructive practices. It doesn't really clearly say that corporations are liable for those destructive practices. And target 16, which you just saw, merely promotes responsible consumer choice. But let's be serious, a lot of people in this world, especially with the price hikes that we've seen over the last years, are not in a position to choose anymore. I mean, it's very unfair to put a burden on millions of very poor consumers that they are the ones who now should, consume sustainably, which often means buying things for higher prices, while corporations are still allowed to produce a lot of junk food and very destructive products that cause biodiversity loss. And then, for example, Target 7 on pollution lacks ambition, and it's quite contradictory. On the one hand, it says to reduce pollution risks to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem function and services, which is very, very positive, actually, considering cumulative effects. That is also really important. And for example, it includes also an already existing target that came from UNEP on reducing excess nutrient loss to environment by at least half, and reducing the overall risk from pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals by at least half. However, for a lot of people, this does not go far enough. I mean, if you only have 50% reduction of hazardous chemicals by 2030, we're not going to save biodiversity from these often very far-reaching impacts that these chemicals and pesticides have. So yeah, there should have been a lot more ambitious targets here. There is a positive side also about working towards eliminating plastic pollution. Of course, this is aligned also with the efforts that are currently being undertaken to reach a global treaty to halt plastic pollution, which is something that should be very, very strongly supported, which is also key for biodiversity. And then the last and the very biggest, trickiest element of all of this is actually in the finance, because we all know that in the end, finance will determine action, and where the finance is coming from and where the finance is going to will also determine where the priority actions are being taken. And this is actually the biggest gap in the whole Global Biodiversity Framework, because it very nicely asked for $200 billion, which was still a lot less than some people asked for. But only $30 billion by 2030, and less before that, is to be provided through official development assistance. So that means that $170 billion is basically a present development countries have to give themselves, insofar that they talk about domestic resource mobilization, or basically just suit yourself, just raise it yourself. Which of course is quite a violation of the whole principles of equity that are embedded in the Convention on Biodiversity, the recognition that because so much of the most precious world's biodiversity is in developing countries and has already been destroyed by developed countries, there should be common but differentiated responsibility, and there should be a financial flow going from the north to the south to help developing countries conserve their biodiversity. But even worse, there's a very big open wide door in the relevant clauses, the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also this related resource mobilization strategy for the private sector. So basically, there's like, welcome private sector, please mobilize funds for biodiversity conservation. And this includes what you call philanthrocapitalists. So very rich donors. And of course, we have to realize that also these philanthrocapitalists are earning their money through very big industries like Amazon, to mention just one, which those industries have a very strong negative destructive impact on biodiversity all over the world. So it's a little bit dubious if that kind of funding is then used as the main source of biodiversity conservation. In the end, you end up in a situation in which, some of the biggest sources of biodiversity funding are actually earned by very destructive activities. Aside, there's literally, the GBF literally widely opened the door for funding derived from biodiversity offsets and what they call nature-based solutions. This was a very long battle whether that term would be included or not. And why was this so controversial? Because nature-based solutions sound like something very positive, but the hopeless thing is that if you look at but what funding is at this moment going to nature-based solutions, the overwhelming majority is carbon offsets, voluntary carbon offset projects. I mean, already a company like Shell has more than $500 million invested in nature-based solution, and that's all to offset their emissions. Now, what is the big problem with that? I'll just show you in a little video next time, the next slide. But carbon offsets are really something the world cannot afford anymore. It's a very simple story, actually. If you see how deep the climate crisis at this moment is, we cannot allow emissions to continue and to simply offset them by projects that are often very, dubious as far as their additionality is concerned, whether they really add something to the existing situation. In fact, research found out that some 94% of offsets verified by one of the biggest verification companies were really not additional. So you basically don't do anything extra, but you do have a lot of additional emissions being excused by those offsets. And that's just one of the many problems with this system. But of course, the overall problem is also that if corporations become the main donors of biodiversity conservation, they will also become the main decision makers in biodiversity policy. I mean, this will only increase corporate control over the whole biodiversity convention process and over biodiversity policies and actions on the ground. I mean, if you really have to mobilize $170 billion from the private sector is that will decide what is being conserved and what is not being conserved. And of course, they will focus on, very simple little projects like tree planting, even though it's often the wrong trees on the wrong place, because that sounds nice for the public. Or they will focus on, very big mammals and not on the ugly little monsters that you can find in the ocean floor that are now being threatened by deep sea mining. So I really think that this is one of the biggest threats that is at this moment on the table is the Global Biodiversity Framework, is that this whole emphasis on private funding will also lead to a lot of corporate capture of the entire policy-making process. And just to flag at the end, I mean, we've been looking a little bit about this Global Biodiversity Fund. Where that will go is still not clear, but it's not per definition said that a new Global Biodiversity Fund would address this corporate capture of biodiversity finance and policymaking. I mean, the first points that were made there, that were put on the table for the proposal, did not necessarily exclude that. So a lot of work is needed to ensure that any new funding mechanisms would actually be freed up from this corporate sector. So this is actually a big risk that we ended up this global biodiversity framework that might end up only conserving 30% through offsetting the destruction of 70%. If we still have time, we can quickly play this video for 2.5 minutes. Yeah? Yeah. And then I very much welcome question. I've kept this relatively brief. Well, brief, it's a very comprehensive story. If you want to know more also about these other 6 decisions, etc., please just ask.
Can you see my screen okay? Is this fine?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you hear the video?
Cover up their dirty business by pretending to be green, but their scams have dangerous consequences. Take JBS. You probably don't know that it is the biggest meat company in the world, but you probably do know that the Amazon and other habitats are destroyed for cattle and animal feed. JBS buys cattle from ranchers that have illegally occupied indigenous people's lands, cleared forests, and set fires that release millions of tons of climate-wrecking pollution. In fact, JBS's global emissions are estimated to be about half those of oil giants Shell or BP. But how can JBS get away with this pollution? The answer? Marketing scams. By promising a net zero, carbon neutral, bright future by 2040, JBS wants to convince the world that it is part of the climate solution. But don't be fooled. Globally, forests need protection, and emissions must halve in less than a decade. But JBS's plan does not tackle the fundamental source of its climate impact, methane from cattle. And JBS's net zero plan allows it to profit from destroying the Amazon and other habitats for years to come, fueling the climate and biodiversity crisis.
Thank you very much, Simone, for your presentation and also for that amazing video. I think you were in your presentation, you were able to introduce this quite complex topic, quite complex negotiations and these outcomes in a very good and simple way. As you know, some of us, we have been following some news about this negotiation, but for some of us is also something quite new. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many of us did. So I want to open the floor now for questions, comments, reactions. As we are not too many, I say we could just activate our microphones and go ahead if you want to. Please feel free.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Simone. That was a really, really fascinating presentation. I have a question about this is maybe just some ignorance around the CBD. I know the CBD is not an obligatory instrument. How do you manage compliance with this? How does the CBD manage compliance with this Global Biodiversity Framework?
Very good question. It is legally binding. But the problem is always with international law that to then hold governments or corporations accountable at a national level often needs an additional legal step that needs translation. So governments are basically obliged to translate this into their national biodiversity action plans and strategies. That's in the decision. But yeah, if they don't do that, what do you do? That's often the problem. Having that said, I think people shouldn't underestimate the potential for trying to use these concrete targets. And that's why I really try to emphasize some of the more useful outcomes as well, to use them in their daily conversation, their daily work. You know, if you talk to a bank or a corporation about a potential destructive project, or remind them that they're supposed to align their commitments with the Global Biodiversity Framework, and you can really say, well, you know, you're violating what's been agreed now in Montreal. With governments, you know, if they want to establish a protected area, remind them that this is the target, that it should be actively governed, that there should be free, prior, and informed consent, and that the rights of indigenous people should be respected. So I think especially for indigenous peoples and local communities themselves, I mean, they can really use this as a political tool. If in the end, you know, plans go ahead, I mean, just now, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo is planning to actually auction some 30 different oil fields with complete violation of free, prior, and informed consent of the local communities and indigenous peoples that live in those areas. Also several overlap protected areas, actually, including Virunga National Park. So we a complete violation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. But yeah, the next step, I mean, to try to do a legal action, I think there's sometimes possibilities, and that they should be explored more. I know from, for example, in the Netherlands, a couple of famous court cases have now been held on basis of climate agreements that are equally not, you know, very specifically legally binding, let's say it like that, because of course also the Paris Agreement just puts 1.5 as an overall target, but it doesn't say that country needs to reduce that much. But even though that was more generic, it has succeeded. You know, some groups have succeeded to actually oblige the Dutch government to reduce emissions on basis of that agreement and Paris Agreement. So there are opportunities, and I think people shouldn't underestimate them. But just waiting until things are being implemented is often not the right strategy, because for a lot of governments, it's also such a comprehensive package that, you know, it's often very easy to sort of overlook certain targets and to just focus on one or two without looking very much in detail what actually all the text entails. So a lot of, you know, vigilance and monitoring is necessary to make sure this becomes a reality.
Thanks. Sorry, quick follow-up question to that. Are there any tools within the CBD to ensure that kind of monitoring and not a pick and choose approach to which targets, etc.?
Yeah, so basically this whole monitoring system that has been set up, I mean, countries are supposed to develop, so adapt their strategies and action plans, and then to report on those every couple of years. So in that process, of course, you can hold them accountable. I must say, yeah, they've been trying to do that, for example, also on the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, through the high-level political forum. And to make that very concrete is sometimes difficult. I mean, we've been doing there's been shadow reports about that by civil society and the women's group, for example. But it's sometimes difficult because, to really get attention to that kind of contradictory information, it's not always that easy, and there's a big risk that national reports become just a show of the good things and completely ignore all the bad things that are happening in a country. So yeah, what's really needed around that is a lot of additional media outreach, but especially legal actions can also be helpful in certain cases to really hold actors accountable.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask a question, Marcos? Okay. Hi, Simone. It's lovely to see you. I think probably the last time we saw each other in person was at a CBD event.
Yeah.
I can't remember where, but it would have been with the ICCA consortium. So it would have been probably at least 10 years ago, which is crazy. But yeah, it's great to see you.
Haven't changed at all, by the way. Yeah. Nothing.
You too. Yeah, thank you for that brilliant presentation, and it was it reminded me a lot of work with the ICCA consortium. A question, Simone, it might be too broad a question, but we're going to be holding a community exchange for, sorry, my video is, I have a problem with my my Zoom at the moment. We're going to be holding a community exchange for environmental defenders, probably at the end of this year, and it will be about how do we support people working in defending the environment, and essentially, being a whistleblower to greenwashing scams such as these. Do you have any idea, or do you think it's getting harder for people calling out, for example, the video of JBS? Was there sort of a threat for the people producing that video, or how much is the climate changing? Is in the kind of campaigning advocacy climate, do you think it's getting more dangerous? Do you think it's getting easier? Do you think it's getting harder? Do you have any direct experiences, or
I think it's getting harder because corporations are becoming afraid, and of course more financial interests are at stake now, as more people become more successful in halting projects. Actually, they become more vicious, and that's and the saddest thing is that the people who are most threatened are not, for example, the producers of this video. I mean, not that I know of. I mean, of course, I know Greenpeace colleagues do have to take precautions, but the people who are by far most threatened are the community representatives and the indigenous representatives. I mean, the people on the ground, they are often the first victims. They're in their village, in places with very little vigilance, with very strong corporate dominance, often armed guards, It's really very scary. And I mean, of course, yeah, same thing actually for those who are trying to insist on their territorial rights, for example, in the protection of being confronted by conservationists, by protected area managers, you know, in especially in Africa, but actually all over the world. There have been horrific cases also of including assassinations in the name of conservation of people that are basically trying to defend their territorial rights. So that also comes, yeah, from different sides. I think the latter, I have hope that with this paradigm shift, that this TBF will actually help a lot. I'm afraid for the corporations, for corporate destruction. What helps a lot is that, you know, you can get more information out these days, and I think getting that out and blaming and shaming corporations, you know, pointing at the links and making sure that human rights violations are also properly taken into account in global corporate accountability frameworks. I mean, the new legally binding treaty on corporate accountability that they're currently negotiating at the United Nations, or the EU legislation that has to be a lot more sharp on that. I mean, the call to ensure that in this new EU legislation on zero deforestation commodities, which in itself is a very good sign that, you know, countries take responsibility for their ecological footprint, for the consumption, but to also include human rights violation in there is absolutely key. I mean, it's basically there. I mean, people shouldn't overlook the fact that the legislation does say it should be in line with national laws. And of course, assassinations are seldom in line with national laws. So basically, the most serious human rights violations are already in that legislation. And they should be, you know, they should be announced, you know, there should be more information on the table. And that's where everybody can basically help it, by just making sure the information gets out and threats get out, and you know, hopefully before that there's deadly consequences.
Thank you, Simone.
Yeah, it's a tough battle on the floor.
Yeah, just popping in the chat a link to a documentary I recently watched. I really recommend watching if you can access it in whichever country people are in. It's called Finite: The Climate of Change. And it's just a really important documentary to show there's a group of people who are protesting to conserve ancient woodland. I think it's maybe outside of Hamburg. And then also the case in the UK of a village who are trying to protect their village from coal extraction. And I sort of watched it, and it made me feel kind of angry and hopeful at the same time, but also the importance of, yeah, not ignoring direct action. And just as you said, to make sure that we keep calling these things out. And yeah, so it just made me think of that quite a bit. And it would be great to speak to you more, Simone, at some point about our event about environmental defenders, because we're sort of pulling together that program now.
Yeah, no, sure. That'll keep me posted. Sounds really interesting, really important.
Well, hi, Simone. Good to see you, and hello to everybody. I really enjoyed that. So good to have a recap from somebody who's really following it. And one of the things I'd like to explore a little bit is to follow the money. There's a lot in your presentation. There's a lot, of course, in the overall framework, but we've all been focusing on, and you referred to a fair amount too, is the finance part. You know, will the fund be set up? But to what role will corporations and private enterprise be involved in providing the money for biodiversity conservation? Let me give a little bit of background on this particular assembly or collective of people. You know, of course, that it's part of the Global Environments Network, which you're familiar with. But this summer, last summer, I should say, we had our 7th Global Environment Summer Academy. And as part of that, we had a little session on fundraising. And out of that, we decided to develop this group meeting every Tuesday. And we were developing at the beginning Darwin Initiative proposals together. You may know the Darwin Initiative from the UK. DEFRA, the UK government, that was actually started, speaking of CBD, when John Major went to Rio in '92 and promised money for biodiversity conservation, and then it turns into biodiversity and livelihoods. So we, over the course of, I don't know, maybe 20 sessions or so, we talked about a lot of things, but we did turn our attention to the whole realm of where the money comes from and where the money goes for biodiversity conservation. We had a really nice session with Fred Nelson of Maliasili, who I think you probably know. And he has written with other people a report recently called Greening the Grassroots, pointed out that the massive amount of money, let's just talk about biodiversity conservation and not even climate change. But so much of the money is coming from the global north, and it's not really getting to the global south except for in trickle down. You know, his whole point was global north funders give money to global north NGOs. Global north NGOs, like, you know, parse it out under quite sometimes unfavorable conditions to global south NGOs who we all know are really doing the work. So we've been exploring these issues and discussing a lot. I just wanted to give you that background because, you know, finance and fundraising is maybe not one of the most interesting things about biodiversity, but it turns out to be quite compelling when you think about the money that's money that's proposed, where it's going to be coming from, and the impact that that funding is going to have. So I just wondered if we could explore and even do that all together, because we've been thinking about that, of a little bit what Simone said about the money and where it's coming from. The fact that if it does come from private sector, from corporations, how much will they be controlling the biodiversity agenda? And the really specific question I have for reflection is there anything we can do, as we've been already talking about in our group, to reorient the approach, the philosophy, the kind of worldview of these funders, so that the funding reaches the people who really need that funding to do the work that we would like to see, rather than this be a greenwash or a whitewash? What can we do to reach out to those philanthropists, next-gen venture philanthropists, more switched on private enterprise that, you know, doesn't really want to greenwash, but really would like to have social impact be part of its DNA, of their DNA? How can we affect governments, private foundations, you know, family offices, to make sure that they're aware of these issues and that they're putting their money in the right place? So I'll end there. It's just that I look at everything you presented and I just think, man, these are really compelling ideas for a transformative future. Like if we really, really did this, worked with Indigenous people, worked with local communities, really did the biodiversity work that needs to be done, we could be in a really different space in 10 years, in 30, less than 10 years or beyond. But we also have the possibility that it can be business as usual. So sorry, that was a bit long, but those are some of the thoughts that were on my mind, particularly in the context of this group. Again, very specifically, can we get the conversation started so those potential funders know the issues, feel compelled by the issues, and put their money in the right place? Maybe that's a direct question to you to start, Simone, and then a comment from anybody else who would like to.
Thanks so much, Guy, for that question. But I really think I would be really interested to hear more from other people about this as well. Just to say briefly, I mean, happily, I mean, the issue has been raised and the discussion has started based on, you know, Fred's report and other very useful reports about, you know, the inequity and in terms of, on the one hand, theoretically recognizing the contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities, and then in the end the money goes elsewhere. So you have, for example, in Glasgow, the climate conference of the parties in 2021, there was a very important declaration in which basically there commitment to significantly raise the amount of funding that is going directly to indigenous peoples and local communities. In itself, that wasn't repeated here. I probably also wasn't the place because, you know, there were more generic commitments, but it was a lot said in, you know, there was a whole finance day, for example, where a lot of the big philanthropies and other big donors came together, also a lot of potential and real corporate donors, and there is a lot of talk, at least, about indigenous peoples and local community work, and the whole issue you raised actually was quite an issue of debate in Montreal at that day, for example. Now, how to concretize it, that is, you know, to go from that theoretical discussion to actually action on the ground and really redirecting these funds. Just to say, I think we should also ask ourselves two big questions. On the one hand, I hope you had time to read the text on the plate of this indigenous activist on my very last slide. Well, one but last slide, the one before the mermaid. It actually has said carbon offsets are tearing us apart. I mean, one of the big problems is, you know, actually increasing these very dubious flows of financial support to indigenous peoples or local communities is that you basically deliver the decision-making power of what's happening in indigenous people's territories and community conserved areas to those corporations that start financing it. And do you really want that? Do you want a big mining company to support an ICCA? If that means that that mining company will then try to make a little deal with that ICCA and say, well, you know, you have free, prior, and informed consent about your territory, but if you just, you know, continue to do that on 95% of your territory and allow us to mine in the remaining 5%, do we have a deal? And I'll give you a lot of money for it. Do you want that? So I think it's also very risky. I think we should always be very vigilant and cautious about where the money is coming from. And I must admit, yeah, I did a PhD research on basically what is motivating actors in international and national policy making, in forest policy making, and financial flows motivate. You don't bite the hand that feeds you. So if you're being funded by Shell, your next campaign is not going to be against Shell. And we're on a slippery slope there. I think we should be really cautious because you see the Green Climate Fund, for example, it's massive, the amount of corporate funding that's going into it and that's subsequently going out to it towards corporations. And you know, there's very little transparent control about it. And because it's just big amounts of money, everybody's in favor of it. I mean, we've attended, yeah. And I've seen that in other donor meetings as well, that, you know, then the rest of the countries are silent because they are waiting to be the next one in line to receive funding. And you're not going to destroy that process by suddenly asking critical questions about, hey, is this a good project? So yeah, it's a very slippery slope we're on at the moment.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in on that based on our discussions. I mean, certainly in GDF, we have a lot of discussion about due diligence of who's giving us the funding and whether or not we want to accept that. But, you know, there's just a lot of other players out there in the game. So plenty of other people that would like to accept money, different ways of looking at due diligence. Certain people feeling any money is good money, it's going to a good cause, and you know, I don't think anybody in GDF feels that way, and that we really want to know the origins. At the same time, we always look, and I think all of us do, to think about where money comes from in general. We've just been handsomely funded by MAVA Foundation for the last 5 years, and you know, that's money that comes from a pharmaceutical company in its origin. So many of the foundations that are very distant from the corporate source of the funds are still connected historically or even contemporarily to sources of funding that's coming from industries that we find problematic. So as you said, there's lot of it's a slippery slope. You know, I don't think we mind refusing money, but on the other hand, you have a whole range of possibilities of considering that the money is coming more proximately or more distally from sources that we really are not consistent with our values, with our mission, with our vision. I don't know. Anybody else have any thoughts about that?
I like how you framed your question, Gary, because I was thinking about the same issue, but from a very passive way. You frame it, what can we do to change how and where money is flowing? My question was much more passive. I wanted to ask Simone, what should we expect to happen in the next years with the funding opportunities based on this new framework?
Of course, the good news is that there will be also more public funding. Now, that's not always, you know, undisputed. Of course, governments in the end make their money through corporate activities as well. But, you know, there also will be, yeah, for a lot of an increasing public funding. For example, International Climate Initiative of Germany has already announced a significant increase of their funding for biodiversity. And yeah, they formally want to do that gender just and with respect for indigenous people's local community rights. I think there's opportunities there for people. The other, I think in general, we need to really emphasize also that well-targeted funding, you know, towards indigenous peoples or local communities is often very much the quality also, and not so much just the quantity that makes things happen. You know, they really need funding for enabling activities, for strengthening themselves, for, you know, and that's often not the billions that are being spent on, for example, centralist tree planting projects, or, for example, all those, you know, quite pathetic conservation, forest conservation projects these days that actually are, you know, just marking a forest that wasn't threatened in the first place and then say, this is my carbon. You know, that kind of thing, supporting people, I think can in their struggles, in their daily struggles, can really help them. So I think that's that's also a hopeful picture, because I actually think that in pure financial terms, I mean, if you would spend the billions that will now be increased in a very good and strategic manner towards indigenous people's local communities, and that's really where the challenge is, they could probably do a lot more with it than a lot of the big some of the big organizations that are at this moment the main recipients of that funding. And especially, you know, if you look at things like REDD+ schemes and voluntary carbon offset markets, it's disgusting the amount of funding that remains actually within the system that is not being spent on actual conservation activities. So that is also something you could really address. If you can redirect that funding, you know, from all these you know, very expensive offsetting and you know, reduction schemes that need all kinds of quantified calculations, and as a result, most of the funding is actually remaining in the consultancy firms that do the quantification and the verification and all those expensive people that are just dancing around the carbon offset market at the moment. And if you would really, including a lot of speculators, because nowadays there's a lot of new markets arising also with blockchain technology, etc., that are basically speculating in new and old voluntary carbon offsets. It's really a very scary market nowadays. It's been so financialized, and a lot of money is being spun just to make more money for the people who are into the financial game and not into conservation at all. It will be interesting to do an analysis, actually. It wouldn't surprise me if that far more than half of the funding in the voluntary carbon offset market is actually being spun around amongst, people speculating with this new financial flows instead of actually any conservation on the ground. So that's why this whole offsetting schemes is exceptionally dangerous. It's exceptionally frustrating. It's a huge waste of money. It's a huge waste of money. And of course, the financial interest is massive. Companies like JBS being able to claim that they are carbon neutral. I mean, that's a nice financial gain. So yeah, there's a lot of, but yeah, the hopeful thing I think is you can also use, if you're well targeted, you can do a lot with relatively less money. And the other big thing is just stop financing destruction. I mean, that would already be such a step forward. Divestment campaigns can be so important in this matter. If you see how much of the destruction of the Amazon is actually being financed, it's far more than is going into Amazon conservation. If we would just stop financing the destruction of the Amazon, you would hardly need money for conservation. That could be millions, because at this moment there's billions going into destruction. All the subsidies and fiscal incentives that go into the cattle industry in Brazil are just amazing.
Yeah, those excellent reflections, and you're right, Marco. It's really, we're on that dual track of how do we play the game, because we do realize that there'll be biodiversity funding coming down, and we're very interested in being able to capture some of that, help the people in the Global Environments Network capture some of that, to do this particularly since the Global Environments Network is primarily Global South based. I mean, it's universal. I mean, it's global, but it is, I think if we count it up, we probably have more people from Global South countries than from Global North countries by a fairly large margin. So, how do we play the game, and how do we teach people how to play the game to get the funding to do good things? And then how do we change the game? So you're absolutely right, Marcos. That's just one of the things that we're interested in, is play the game, change the game. And playing the game puts us in touch with a lot of people who are the potential funders, family foundations in Switzerland, in Germany, government sources of support in Switzerland and in England, and of course the United States is always out there. But also all of these next gen venture philanthropists. And I think the interesting thing about having the dialogue be how do we play the game and how do we change the game is that we really have the ability to have that conversation. And what we've found is that people really do want to have that conversation. Now, when we talked to Fred, it was quite interesting because he's had a really good response from foundations, as you may know, Simone. They really appreciated what he wrote and what that report was about. And I've talked to people from Oak Foundation and many others who say, yeah, we're actively trying to implement this. The big pushback, or at least the sort of, clear silence, came from big international NGOs who may not find that to be such a favorable circumstance if family foundations go directly to Global South organizations. Anyhow, I really enjoyed that discussion. I maybe want to necessarily close that parentheses, but I did want to say that I find it really important for our group, for Biodiversity and Livelihoods Collective, to pay very close attention to what's going on in the Global Biodiversity Framework. There are a lot of, so many strands and threads of conversations going on. We are very interested in Global Diversity Foundation, or we have been, not exclusively, but very interested in plant conservation. And so I noticed that the global partnership for plant conservation out of Botanical Gardens Conservation International, Suzanne Sherrick, Peter Wise Jackson, have both, just recently sent out saying something. We have a decision from the COP15 that we should rethink the global strategy for plant conservation for these new goals. And so all of these little ramifications of that overall discussion are happening. And, it behooves us. It's important for us to pay attention to as many of those conversations as we can. One of the potential benefits of having a very broad collective like the Global Environments Network is that we have people working in many different countries, many different aspects of biodiversity conservation, plant, animal. Valerie, who's here with us, working both, a lot on animals, but very much on plants as well. And so I'm sure this is going to continue to be a topic of conversation. And I just like to thank you again from my side for that very informative and very concise and very interesting discussion of what happened in Montreal.
We are running out of time, but if there are any other questions, yeah, Emily?
Yeah, I have a final question for Simone, which is a bit of a personal question. I met you probably I was in my early 20s, my first CBD meeting or something when I was with Forest People's Program. And you've been doing this work for so long. Are you cynical, or are you an optimist, or are you a pessimist? Like, where do you stand now? You have just changed jobs. Clearly, you're still a fighter, but where do you stand on your belief that we can make a difference through international policy making?
I always say to my colleagues, please keep on seeing the little bright stars in the very dark sky. Of course, so many things are going backwards, but for me, it was also really heartwarming to see finally the recognition, for example, of indigenous peoples and local communities' efforts to conserve the planet, and the recognition of their rights. That's something that didn't appear in the original Convention on Biodiversity. Admittedly, I was there at the negotiations of the convention itself. And it didn't appear at all. There was no indigenous people's participation. There was just no realization, that this has anything together. I remember I wrote a little paper those days about the relationship between cultural and natural biological diversity, and I remember my boss was super enthusiastic, like, oh yeah, this is great stuff. We should continue on this. But since then, that awareness has grown so much, and it's super inspiring, because I think we can learn all together so much from appreciating traditional knowledge, appreciating how different people and different peoples with different epistemologies relate to the planet, what that means in terms of harmony for nature. And I must say, there's just there's some new campaigns being developed in Greenpeace about that as well, and the idea is to look very much at that also, and to compare for just the average social media follower, which are often a lot of urban youth, that are following Greenpeace social media, but to also connect them with that kind of relationship with nature, and to really put that inspiring example of how do you really live in harmony with nature? What can nature give you? What can it mean for you? I think that kind of change, it's happening. It's happening all over the world, and you see so many fantastic local and international projects. I'm going back to Amsterdam now, and I know in my neighborhood there's like a little biodiversity project, and they're starting a food forest in the middle of the city, one of the smallest food forests on earth. But still, the whole enthusiasm that you see with ordinary people, even in especially also in urban areas. I actually didn't mention that target, but there's also a specific new target about greening cities, which is super important, because the majority of people will live in cities, and you really need to connect that. But you can use indigenous people's knowledge, being very rural, and connect that with the experience that people have on trying to green their own urban space. And those kinds of inspirations, I think, are really also the very hopeful paths that you can follow. So yeah, I hope they'll get there. And I'm hearing Gary when he says that, there is a lot of increasing awareness. Of course, I'm sometimes fascinated by some of the environmental officers that work for global corporations, and some of most evil corporation you can imagine, but they often have some very idealistic people working there, really trying every day to change that corporation. And for them, indeed, the conversation about the importance of indigenous people's rights and knowledge is super important. I think they definitely want to do good. I know there is that goodwill. It's just that you then need to look through the structure and also see, okay, so what are the incentives for them to really make the next step? And isn't that immediately going to be blocked by the fundamental commercial interests of the corporation? And I think we do need, also for those people, you need to do that analysis, because it's often not people, but it's a structure that is perverse.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Simone, again, for accepting the invitation, but also for sharing your knowledge, your passion, and this inspiration with us. Thank you all for participating today. I just wanted to remind you that next week we will have also a very interesting session about community seed banks. So we hope to have you with us. And I think we can leave it here for today. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Simone, for
Thanks,
sharing.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.